So, Margaret, it's great to be here with all of our wonderful supporters of the President and Mrs. Carter. But I have to say personally, it's great to be back with you. The Old Girls Network from the Carter years is on the stage.
Well, I say the same thing. And talk about honorary degrees. When I was at Leslie, we awarded Alexis Herman her first honorary degree.
That's right.
Which was great, one of many, I will tell you. But one of the things Alexis probably doesn't know is I wanted her job. So I was in the transition, and I was working for Bob Lipschutz. And he kept saying, come to the White House. And I was like, I'm not a political person. I'm like a policy person. And I'm interested in women's issues. I want to go to the Labor Department. I really want that women's job, Assistant Secretary of Women's Issues. And this went on for weeks. And people didn't understand it because everybody was, like, I want to go to the White House. I want to go to the White House. And I'm like, I don't want to go to the White House. I was scared of all the Georgians, I was like,
That was a lot of Georgians.
Not so much loud, but I was a Yankee. I was from Boston, and I was like and I had done movement politics, but the first campaign I ever did was Carter Mondale in Rhode Island. So finally one day, I'm sitting in the transition office, jeans, sneakers, my feet on the desk, and I look up and there's President Carter. And he says, I heard you don't want to work in the White House for me. And I was like, okay. That was it.
Well, Margaret, I am so glad you didn't get my job, okay? And I'm shocked to hear you say that you wanted to come to the Labor Department, because here we were, you were in the White House. I mean, you were in the inner sanctum, and that's where everybody else wanted to be, and you were there.
Yeah.
And you were our eyes and ears to what the boys were doing in the White House. So I'm glad you took the job. I'm glad you stayed there, and I'm glad that President Carter did appoint me as the director of the Women's Bureau, because for me, even though I loved being labor secretary, it really all started as the director of the Women's Bureau at the Labor Department. And I was just 29 years of age, so I was a real neophyte.
And I was much older. I was much older. I was 31.
Wow. Wow.
So I was much more mature, so I could mentor Alexis.
Yes.
And yesterday we sat and watched Vice President Mondale and President Carter talk about foreign policy and in human rights. And it's so impressive what the administration did. But you don't hear as much about what the administration did for women. But we know that the extraordinary impact that the Carter administration has had on women and the status of women, and what the status of women was in 1976.
That's right. And the reality is, Margaret, we talk about then and now. And I really believe that President Carter does not get the credit that he deserves for truly laying the foundation, the infrastructure of every single initiative that advanced women in the workplace. I mean, that is his legacy, And let me just for a moment talk about that statement. In the 1950s, the 1960s, women were about a third of the workforce, right? And as we inched into the 1970s, we were approaching the 40% mark, But let me tell you, by the mid-1970s, the workforce that Jimmy Carter inherited, it was when we had this mass revolution taking place of women coming into the workforce, all ages, all numbers. And by the time we left, women were nearly half of the workforce. And one of every 6 jobs that Carter created went to a woman. And you know, back during those days when I was at the Women's Bureau, I would get so frustrated because people would always, you know, they kept asking the question, why are all of these women coming into the workplace? We have a clicker here, and you know, I kept wondering why these slides aren't moving.
Because we're not doing our
We're so
job.
busy talking. There it is. That's my cue. They kept asking the question, why is it happening? You know, this was supposed to be a temporary phenomena. The way women came into the workplace, Rosie the Riveter, after World War II, the expectation was that they were going to go back home. And so, you know, family disruption, who was going to take care of the kids? It was like, why is this happening? And so all of the policymakers, even your world later in life, the academic community, great papers were written. No one was trying to answer the question, not why, but how do we support this massive revolution that is now taking place? What are the policies? What are the initiatives? I got another slide.
Okay.
I'm getting this.
Quoting herself here.
And this was my answer. And I used to always say, in the Carter administration, we're not trying to answer the question of why it's happening. We wanted to talk about how do we get the job done? How do we come up with the policies, the initiatives, the legislative framework? I don't know where Jim Free is in this room today. But how do we come up with the legislative framework that ensures that women are going to be equal partners in the workplace? And that's really what it was all about for us.
Yeah, and I think people, you know, it's a long time ago.
Oh, yeah.
But you know, there was not a sex discrimination lawsuit until 1977. The Civil Rights Act was passed in '64.
That's right.
The first publication talking about violence against women, the first was in 1977. First publication, it was Ms. Magazine. People did not talk about it. It was under, you know...
It was under the radar.
People under the radar. People didn't talk about it. So it was a different time. And because no one talked about it, people did not address these problems. But, you know, one of the things that President Carter did was talk about violence against women and funded women's shelters. So not only did it bring it out into the light, it was what we do and how we do it,
That's
not
right.
just why.
That's right.
Solve some of those problems.
That's right. And you know, the actual bill, the first domestic violence bill in this country, was passed by Jimmy Carter, and the Women's Bureau actually funded the first battered women's shelter in this country. You know, and that's why I always say, Margaret, you take any area of women's advancement and support and what we needed, it started with Jimmy Carter. You know, when I first came to Washington, you had worked in the campaign. Well, I was a neophyte from Mobile, Alabama, by way of Atlanta, Georgia, and I met the president through Andy Young. And so my very first policy initiative that I had to work on when I came to Washington was something that was called the Pregnancy Disability Act. Well, first of all, I couldn't figure out why we were calling pregnancy a disability. But I later, you know, came to understand that the General Electric Company had a case before the Supreme Court because they would give a man 6 weeks off to have a hair transplant, but they wouldn't give a woman 6 weeks off to have a baby. True for some of the younger women in here. And know that you would have your job after that time. There was no guarantee that you could come back to work. And so what did we have to do? And you were in the White House. We had to amend Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to say that discrimination based on pregnancy constituted a form of sex discrimination. And I couldn't figure out why people couldn't figure out there was a relationship between pregnancy and sex, but I left that alone too. But we had to do that.
We're talking about unpaid leave.
That's right.
We're not talking about family leave or paid leave. We're just talking about unpaid leave.
And guaranteed rights to come back to your job.
That's all.
So you look at family leave today, the debate on whether or not we're going to have paid family leave today.
Right.
The first leave policy ever started with Jimmy Carter.
Also, so in 1977 was the first sex discrimination lawsuit, but in 1978, Jimmy Carter signed an executive order which said the federal government could not have sex discrimination. So outlawed sex discrimination in the federal government and every federal agency and throughout the government, because Title VII, the 64 Act, did not include the federal government. So even though only one lawsuit had been filed, he then promulgated it for the federal government. And in fact, he really put some teeth into it to enforce it around the government. And people really started to pay attention. There are a lot of women first. I was the first deputy counsel to the president. And there were a lot of firsts, which we'll show you in a minute, of women serving in the administration. But people sat up and paid attention and said, is this guy is real? I mean, this is not like the typical, hire women and people of color. He like means it.
He did. He was walking the talk. And I was so glad to see Secretary Dalton, John, who's been here for all of the years, right? But I especially remember when you talk about that order, that executive order, the transformation that took place in the military.
Yeah.
And, we got the first woman, three-star admiral. You used to be so proud of that, right? And I remember Ross Thomas, who is here with me. It's great to be back with Ross. The president asked us to fly around to the various military bases, Air Force, Army. We went to the Marines. I didn't go on a ship, John, because he wanted to figure out how we could open up more jobs in the military for women. And there were laws in the Army. For instance, you could go into the Army as a man with a high school degree, but you didn't have to have the degree. That's right. A woman had to have a high school degree, right?
Right.
And he changed all of that. And by the time the military, just one agency in the federal government, completed the work on that task force, do you know 92% of jobs in the Army opened up to women? It was really transformational work.
And in your agency,
oh my goodness,
alone, the Labor Department, in terms of working class women, apprenticeships, Social Security benefits, and small business, which you yourself are in.
Yes.
You should talk about.
Well, I credit where I am today, quite frankly, with the work that President Carter commissioned to study the whole question of women business owners in the economy at that time. And there were very few. And there were very few women business owners because, first of all, women could not get credit if you didn't have the signature of your husband or your father. I know, no such thing as a credit card back then. You couldn't do it if you didn't have the permission of your husband or your father. You couldn't get a loan on your own at a bank. There was no access to capital. There's no such thing as mentors and all of that to help you understand what does it take. And so the president commissioned a task force. It was called The Bottom Line in Unequal Enterprise in America. And he wanted us to examine the status of women business owners in our country and come back to him and make the recommendations. I co-chaired that with Pat Clardy, who was then the head of the Small Business Administration. It was a year's worth of work. But after that year, we did all of the documentation, all of the barriers. We laid everything out for the president. And he signed the first executive order, here we go again, back to the first, that empowered women business owners in this country. For the first time, the federal government had a policy where we had to bring in women contractors, where we had to utilize women business owners, and when we didn't have them, we created these centers to develop them. And I look back at that work then, and I look at today's economy. What's the fastest growing segment of our economy today? Small businesses. And guess who that is? It's women. Women are the backbone of small businesses in this country. We're the biggest job creators. And it all started, in my view, with that executive order with Jimmy Carter that went back to the final work in 1979.
And it sounds, we're talking about this like, of course, this was revolutionary.
Yes.
Revolutionary. I mean, it's hard to believe as women that signing a loan or starting a business without your husband or your father signing it. I mean, it's hard for us, particularly women who are younger than us, which is everybody in the room.
Speak for yourself, Margaret.
Speak for yourself. I am 2 years older, I know. I keep it in mind. But I mean, imagine having to go to your husband or your father to get to sign something. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it was revolutionary at the time. President Carter also did symbolic things. The Women's History Month, we know where it started? Jimmy Carter.
That's right.
Signed the first proclamation to start Women's History Month. He was out front, so was Mrs. Carter and Judy Carter on the Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh, my goodness.
Used political capital he was the one who went up and got it, extended the opportunity to pass it.
I think we have something on that, don't we?
No.
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 There it is.
Oh, no.
There it is.
Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay.
You know, when you talk about the ERA
great.
and Rosalynn, I have to tell you, you knew President Carter through the campaign. My first time seeing him officially as president was after we were confirmed, and we had to go back to the White House, all of the Labor Department appointees, and we had to meet in the cabinet room, my first time in the cabinet room with the president. And so all of the appointees were sitting around the cabinet room table, and he was going to come in and congratulate us and thank us. And we had to rehearse for an entire day going to the White House. And we all thought we would get maybe a question from the president. We weren't sure. I stayed up all night the night before, learning everything about the Women's Bureau, the Labor Department. You talk about non-traditional jobs, anything that I thought the president would ask me about regarding my work at the Labor Department. So he's going around the table. He gets to me. I'm ready. You know, ask me anything. Women in non-traditional jobs, women in pension, you know, training for young women. And so he looks at me and he says, Alexis, so what do you think our strategy should be for passing the Equal Rights Amendment? I was like, that's your job in the White House. You develop strategy, we execute, you know. So I was literally tie-tongue. I couldn't even answer him. But the reality was, I think I blurted out something like, well, I think we first got to educate the American people, okay? But when I saw this quote just recently and going through my papers, it reminds me of what you said, that President and Mrs. Carter were just on the front lines. And it wasn't just about the amendment. It was about what the amendment symbolized for American women in this country.
So besides acts, President Carter also walked the talk in terms of appointments. Now, what you're looking at is in the red are all of the appointments from the beginning of time.
Say it again, Margaret.
From the beginning of the country, maybe not the beginning of time, from 1789 until 1977. So there were 2 cabinet secretaries who were women until 1977. And then in 1977, President Carter appointed 3. So undersecretaries, there were 3 and 3. Then you see assistant secretaries, and then you see agency heads. There was 1, and we had 6. General counsels, lawyers, we did very well here. But you can see, this is not a president and President Carter. This is from 1789 and then President Carter.
Yep.
So again, he opened the door to, so we had 3 women cabinet officers, Juanita Krebs, Patricia Harris, and Shirley Hufstede. They're in the new Department of Education. And a number of these agency heads and general counsel was the first woman ever to hold that job. And I think the general counsel was sort of always an interesting one, because when they were trying to figure out who could run a department or who could be an undersecretary, there really is no definition of who can be an undersecretary. And so it's like, well, he can do it, but she, I don't know whether she can do it. But general counsel was, well, she's a lawyer, she must be able to be a lawyer. It was sort of, women had an advantage there because there was a definition, whereas running something, that was more difficult. But you can see what the difference was, and it was an amazing thing. And women had a real network.
That's right.
Around the administration. So we supported each other, and when there was an opening, we were very helpful to find people to fill that job. So we became a network, and we became a funnel for finding people for new jobs.
We had a little influence in the White House on the Office of White House Personnel, too.
Yes, we did. Arnie Miller, some of you may remember, was the director of presidential personnel. He was quite a character. He was also my former husband and the father of our 2 children and now 1 grandchild.
That's what I mean by influence.
That's by influence. We were married then. He's actually quite ill, critically ill. But before I came here, I went to see him. And as usual, he told me what to do. Maybe one reason we didn't stay married forever. But he said a number of things. But one of the things he said that really stuck with me, he said, make sure people understand that in the office, we felt such an honor to work for a man who truly had the values. It wasn't just talking about, in his inner soul, he really believed that women were equal. He really believed that people of color needed to be represented so the administration could be trusted and could have input from people who had always been ignored. Right. He said, and to have that in your pocket and go out to departments and have the president behind you and know that was such an honor. That's right. That's right. And that it was so real. It wasn't just, oh, this is affirmative action, we have to find 2 of these and 1 of those. But to have that in such a real way and such a value. All right, so Arnie, I did what I was told.
Okay. Good for you. But I have to say, looking at this slide, Margaret, and remembering some of these great women who represent that green bar, we created in the Carter administration the pool, literally, from which all subsequent Democratic administrations would then draw. I would not have been Secretary of Labor had I not been the director of the Women's Bureau. Hazel O'Leary in the Clinton administration became the Secretary of Energy. Donna Shalala, who was one of those assistant secretaries, right, is now in the United States Congress. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was chair of the EEOC for President Carter, is now a member of the United States Congress. I could go on with other names of women who were in leadership roles in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration, that they all trace their legacy, experience, and history back to Jimmy Carter. The other thing you said that was so important was this network. I mean, you know, we had our own Underground Railroad, okay? I mean, we were on the phone. We supported one another. And when I think about another great legacy of the president's, we talk about women in non-traditional jobs. Well, Jimmy Carter was the president who opened up the whole field of apprenticeship and the skilled trades movement to women officially. He was the one who signed that executive order. But it would not happen at the Labor Department had I not had a partner in the woman who was the general counsel at the Labor Department, and her name was Karen Klaus. She made it possible for then Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall to put that bill in front of the president to say we had to do this. And I'll never forget, and God forgive me, Reese, if you're up there, because I think it was Reese Hammond who was the head of the operating engineers then. And I can remember we had to go around to every union head trying to convince them that this would not completely ruin the union movement, that we were going to admit women into these skilled trades. And he said to me, Alexis, I just can't see my daughter doing this job. And I had to say, Reese, we're not talking about your daughter. We're talking about women who need these good paying jobs, who have to care for themselves and their families. And so Jimmy Carter made it possible when we use the term non-traditional, when we use the term opening up blue-collar, skilled trades work for women, again, it happened in the Carter administration.
You know, I haven't heard about it was the operating engineers, because the operating engineers were my first civil rights case as a young lawyer,
really?
Suing them for race discrimination. So I guess they didn't think people of color could do the job either. Okay. So that's sort of interesting. I want to move on to something that I think is one of President Carter's most important legacies. When President Carter took office, the appellate court had appellate courts. There were then 9, there are now 11. There was one woman sitting on an appellate court. There were 5 women out of 400 on the district courts. And there had only in history, again, let's go back to the beginning of time of the country, there had only been 8 women who had ever served in the federal bench. 8 women. There had only been 2 African-American, they were men. That's from 1789 to when President Carter took office. I mean, that's amazing when you think about it. It's just amazing. And he opened that door in a way, and you'll see here, look at what, we're talking here about, again, this chart is not when he came in, it is from, again, the beginning of 1789 to present, and then his appointment. And he opened that door, and he kicked that door down. And that door has stayed kicked down. And he did it. When I say kicked down, I mean kicked down. He had a plan. He said, as a candidate, I am going to change the bench, the federal bench, to look like America. And before he was even inaugurated, he went to see Senator Eastland. who was the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And he said, I need your help. And he went to the senator's office. And he said, I need your help. I want to put together these merit panels for the Circuit Court of Appeals. And I want to put people on it, non-lawyers as well, to recommend 3 people as judges. Now, this is a very big deal because until now, all federal judgeships were patronage. All. They came out of, the senators said, this person worked in my campaign, and they should be a judge. Circuit Court and District Court. And Senator Eastland agreed. This is the first time we've had a Southern governor in decades and decades. And he said, really, I want you to be successful, and so I'll agree. He didn't agree in the district courts. He said, you're on your own in the district courts, but I'll agree to the panels in the Court of Appeals. And in the end, President Carter got 30 of the senators in the district courts to agree to put merit panels together. So that was a big piece of why it worked, is we got it out of the clutches of the senator just appointing just with patronage.
Now, did you say the president actually went to Senator Eastland's office and sat down?
Went to his office. I know that's hard to believe today.
Know, that's what I was like.
That someone would actually go to the Hill to ask for a favor, but he did. And he got, remember, he talked to Republicans about this.
A bipartisan strategy?
A bipartisan strategy. Bipartisan. People remember that word, bipartisan? Yes. So until now, that was a very big thing, the merit panels, and there were a lot of women on these panels, and there were a lot of people of color and non-lawyers. And one of the things is that most of them apartments were looked at by lawyers who were white and male from big firms. And who did they know?
White males
from big firms, right? So this started to open up because some of the people now on the panel knew people who were from who were doing family law, who were from small firms, single practitioners, people who were working for the Lawyers Committee in Civil Rights, people who were, in all kinds of different positions, not just in big prestigious firms. The other thing that happened is this was when the women's movement was really taking off. So we had some real support from outside when we needed it. And the third thing was the Omnibus Judgeship Act. We had 152 new judgeships to fill, which was great. And there's 2 other things that the president did. The first 18 months, we were not very successful. In our office, Bob Lipschutz was an enormous support in this. I mean, he had known Jimmy Carter forever. They spoke the same language. Most of the time, they didn't understand me at all. And he was great. And there were 2 of us who came from civil rights, Doug Uron and I, and we were pushing. And Bob was very supportive, and so was the president. But the Attorney General had usually been the person who had recommended judgeships. And we found ourselves in a sort of, when the 3 names would come up from the commission, there would normally be 2 white men and someone else who would be a woman or a person of color. The Attorney General would rank them, and inevitably the person of color and the woman would be on the bottom. And then we would switch them.
In the White House.
In the White House, and the Attorney General did not look like. And when I was preparing for this talk, it'd been 40 years ago, I didn't have that much of a memory, I found all these little memos that said, I think Margaret McKenna should be fired from the Attorney General. She's annoying.
See, that's why you needed to be in the White House.
Right,
you see, you
right.
had that legacy of history.
He may not be the only person who thinks I'm annoying, but this was annoying in a different way. She keeps trying to interfere in the process. Well, it's true, we did interfere in the process. And then we finally went to the president, and again, with Bob's support, and we said, we need you to do two things. The Attorney General had gone to the chairs, we need you to go and speak to the chairs of these commissions. And he did. He put himself on the line, and he did just what Arnie said. You know, he went and he said, I'm serious. I don't want judges to look like who's on the bench today. I want judges to look like America. I want people to have faith in our court system, and they are not going to have faith in the court system if they look like the courts today. That changed everything. The second thing that happened is the ABA, at first, the first woman two women that went to the ABA were found unqualified. Well, the president was like beside himself, because they were women who were absolutely qualified, but they were being judged by, guess who? White, male partners in big firms. He then went to the ABA. We asked him, he said, sure.
Unheard of.
The first ever. He goes to the ABA committee and he says, you have two choices. You either look at our candidates holistically and everything they've done, that they taught and they've written and they've worked at small firms and they've worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And no, they haven't worked at a big firm. Or we are not going to send our names to you to be reviewed.
Wow. Now, Margaret, you know what? I think some of us know that this is a big part of the president's legacy, right? I mean, he did transform the judiciary. But listening to you, I'm hearing something that I didn't realize before, because presidents appoint, right? And of course, he did that. But this president developed the pool from which he drew his own appointments.
Yeah.
He was the one, when you talk about the work with the ABA, when you talk about creating these merit panels, the process that he put in place actually helped to develop the actual pool from which he could then draw from to appoint these judges. That is extraordinary.
Yeah, it absolutely was extraordinary. And for him to put himself on the line like this was amazing. Yeah. As some of the things we talked about earlier. I want to talk about two cases in particular. One was one of the first women he put on the circuit court, Phyllis Kravitz. Again, she was one of three. The two others were white men. And we sat, and the Attorney General wouldn't give up. We wouldn't give up. It was months going on, and we couldn't convince him. He couldn't convince us. And so one day I'm walking through the halls. I run into Kathy Cade. She's here somewhere, the chief of staff to Mrs. Carter. And I tell her my tale of woe. She said, oh, Mrs. Carter is having lunch with the president today. Okay. I said, well, you know, it would be really great to have this woman on the Fifth Circuit, which includes Georgia, right? So that afternoon, strangely, we get this memo which checks Phyllis Kravitz as the nominee from the president, right after lunch.
Yeah. Yeah, that, you know, most people don't realize how much the First Lady was a part of our Underground Railroad movement. She did a lot.
She did a lot.
Yeah. So,
and the second one I want to mention is Nathaniel Jones, which is Nathaniel Jones was the general counsel of NAACP. African American, incredibly well respected. We were in the same situation with the Justice Department, and the senators, Senator Glenn, as in John Glenn, astronaut, Senator Metzenbaum, each had a candidate, and they couldn't even agree. And Griffin Bell said, "I'll take anybody except Nathaniel Jones." So we sat. And so there was the 25th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And I said, Bob, this is the day. We can make this happen. This is the day. Because Nate was the general counsel, NAACP, which is the people who brought Thurgood Marshall, was his predecessor, brought the case, Brown versus Board of Education. So this is it. So Bob, go down to the president with the memo, see if we can get him to sign it. I hovered at the door. The president said, yeah, let's do it. So in the East Wing are, 300 people, including Alexis, celebrating Brown versus Board of Education. The president walks over, Nate Jones is in the room, and the president says to Bob Lipschitz, you call Griffin and tell him we're doing this while I'm walking over. And he goes over and announces the appointment.
Yeah, it was a wonderful moment. Oh,
everybody was ecstatic.
Yeah.
But again, it's the kind of thing he's able to do. I want to also mention just a few names of people we put on the bench. Pat Wald, the first woman in the D.C. Circuit who became the Chief Justice, passed away just a couple of weeks ago. Stephen Breyer, who then became a Supreme Court Justice, and one other person you may have heard, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah. And what I love about when Ruth's appointment, Justice Ginsburg's appointment, came up, she was not a lawyer. I mean, she was a lawyer. She was in academia. She didn't have the traditional experience. She was an academic, and he did it anyway.
He unless he had gone to the ABA and done what he did, she would have been found unqualified.
No question about it.
She would not have made it to the circuit court.
So, Margaret, I know that we could keep talking forever about the legacy of Carter and judgeships because he did transform the judiciary. I just left Nate Jones in Cincinnati, and he still tells that story. And he never fails to thank Jimmy Carter wherever he is. But I want to ask you, because we do have to take a few minutes, Jay's looking at me, to go to the audience for questions. I have to ask you, when you step back, given the legacy of judgeships we all know is huge and tremendous, but what else rises to the top for you when you think about President Carter and the legacy, the foundation that he laid for women in this country?
I would say the two things that come to mind are the Social Security benefits and small business. I would say those are the two things. Domestically, those are the two things.
And maybe when you say Social Security, maybe, again, some of you don't remember that when President Carter came into office, we had all of these displaced homemakers who, because of the high divorce rates that were taking place, who suddenly found themselves, who'd spent their lives taking care of their families and their children without any preparation for the world of work, and they needed training, they needed support. He passed the first displaced homemaker legislation to give them training, but more importantly, it was 20 years, wasn't it? You had to wait 20 years
right,
to get Social Security benefits from your husband when you were married. You had to be married for 20 years.
You had to be married for 20 years.
You had to be married for 20 years. As a part of this legislation, the president reduced that from 20 years to 10 years. And that law is still there today so that women don't have to wait to get their Social Security benefits.
I just wanted to say one thing about today. I hate to even mention his name, but the incumbent president.
I thought we weren't going to do that.
I know. 92% of his appointments so far are white men. He has appointed more judges in 2 years than any other president. President Carter appointed more judges in his 4 years than any other president. And the incumbent president has appointed more judges under 45 than any president in history.
So they're going to be there a long time.
Ooh.
He's calling you.
My son.
You're getting ready to get a tweet. You're going to get a tweet. That is remarkable.
Yeah,
That is
so it's
remarkable,
very
Margo.
scary, and it's why we need to win the Senate
Yeah.
and the presidency, because it's so serious.
A lot is at stake. You know, for me, I would agree about the Women Business Owners Initiative. I became an entrepreneur myself. That's been my chosen path. And I just represent, I think, you know, many of the hundreds of thousands of women now who chose that entrepreneurial path. So for me, the Women Business Owners Initiative has always been at the top. But I'll tell you something else that rises for me. We talk a lot today about the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
And sexual harassment in the workplace. Again, Jimmy Carter first. It was under Jimmy Carter that the very first sexual harassment guidelines for workplace behavior were issued under Eleanor Holmes Norton as the chair of the EEOC. And the very first sexual harassment case did not start with Anita Hill, which is what a lot of people think in the public arena, the first time they really heard it. The first Supreme Court case on sexual harassment was in 1986 that we won, and the basis for winning that case was based on the guidelines that were issued by the Carter administration under the leadership of Eleanor Holmes Norton. So the president's commitment to discrimination and empowering women and advancing us has been a part of his legacy from then, before, and even now, as you well know.
Even now, as you see, well,
somewhere we had another
this is
slide.
another slide, but you know, he has taken up as his goal, really as priority, human rights violation and women's inequality has profoundly affected the world, and he sees women's inequality as a first priority in his battle for human rights. And that's where he's been spending his time really for the last decade. So he continues to fight for women and women's rights. And we so appreciate having been able to work for him.
Yes.
It's such an honor, and so appreciate that he continues to fight for us and for the women and girls who follow us.
And before we go to the audience, as the ambassador stands for Q&A, I want to thank especially those of you who continue to support the work of the Carter Center, because the president's continued focus on women and what we have to do, whether it's sex slavery or you walk through the Atlanta airport now and for the first time you hear, see something, say something. It's all because of the foundation, in my view, that Jimmy Carter supported then and continues to do the work of the Carter Center.
Right.
And so God bless you and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well said.
Wow, and speaking personally, I remember, and thank you. Thank you. So, you all know where the mics are? Please come forward and ask questions of our distinguished and entertaining and incredibly important panelists.
Good morning. I'm Becky Humphrey from Clarksville, Maryland. And you have struck a nerve that is so deep in my heart. I entered the workforce in 1971 as a 16-year-old at a junior hot shop. And I remember those days. And I remember not being selected as assistant manager because I was a woman. And an 18-year-old boy who had no experience. I had a degree in food and beverage management from a 2-year college. I deserved that job, but I didn't get it. And what was the recourse? There was none at that time. But what you've done today is you have brought back a whole lot of memories and history, and two of you are just the smartest women I know right now. I mean, yes, there are a lot of smart women out here, and I appreciate every woman that I meet in this group because they all speak so well. My question is, where's the book? I want the book.
Great
He's
question,
somewhere
Becky.
in the audience. we have the author somewhere in the audience. I don't know. There he is. One of the books anyway, right?
We have two.
But we should think about that. I mean,
Yeah.
we really
Please,
should put
please
up.
women,
collaborate.
Yeah,
the
we should
impact-
have something
impact
with
on
women in
women.
it.
Because I think that's one of the books
Yeah.
that has not been written.
Yeah, his legacy in this space, the story has not been told.
Not been.
It really hasn't been.
Thank you, Becky.
Again, thank you. I just quickly Googled it and I couldn't find a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
Thank
right.
you.
I think that's right.
Russ.
Hi, Russ Philbeck. I was going to see during that time when President Carter was president, and I was just wondering, what was the country's reactions to these appointments and all this significant change? What did you see happening as a result of it?
I think we saw everything.
Yeah.
I know when I would go to places and say I was the deputy counsel to the president, they would say the president of what? And I said the president of the country. And people were disbelief. And when we would talk about the appointments, a lot of people would think, well, that's an affirmative action appointment, just like we used to see. But at the same time, you would run into young women, and we were young women,
Yeah,
but
we
I mean
were.
younger women, who were so affected by the range of appointments we had. A lot of us, especially Alexis, were out speaking, and you could see young women say, wow, there's an opportunity here.
Right.
There's an opportunity here to do something like this. So there were all kinds of reactions when you say.
All kinds, yeah. And for me, you know, it ran the gamut. Roz remembers this moment when I visited the Army bases for the first time to talk about women in combat and what we could do to get women into jobs. I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, and I'll never forget, I walked into the general's office, and they had this special banner, quote, made for our visit, and it was over his desk, and it said, you really ought to wanna. I thought, okay. So I said, General, you really ought to wanna what? You remember that? And he says, Miss Herman, I don't care what it is. Whatever it is, you really ought to want to do it. And I don't know if these women are ready for that. So we had this real conversation about, you know, what this meant. On the other hand, I remember child care. We didn't talk about that. Jimmy Carter started the first child care policies, by the way, in the federal government as well. The Department of Labor was the first experimental child care center for the federal government. That then we had these little baby toilets. I didn't even know they could make baby toilets like this. But you know what those baby toilets did, Margaret? We started having open house for baby toilets because people wanted to see this new phenomena of setting up child care centers for children to support women. And the looks on the faces of these women with these small children who had a safe place for their children, it was just extraordinary. So you're right, it just ran the gamut. And when you're working for change, you have to expect that. But what I loved about Jimmy Carter was that he just stayed the course.
Yeah.
No matter what the criticism
He just hung in there.
Yeah, he hung in there.
Donna Shalala and I got to go to Paris Island.
Oh.
And we were not asked, though we were offered the opportunity to go through and try out Paris Island. But we were, you know, put on boots and walked out and saw what they did because they were like, can you think that girls can do this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sure they can. Why not? You know, they were doing everything they could to discourage
Everything.
everything in terms of the military. There was no question about it. We were in a submarine once too, and for some reason they thought that women were more claustrophobic than men.
Yeah, well, I remember that.
And I
Yeah.
didn't understand that because if you're claustrophobic when you're tall, as opposed to shorter, it's much worse when you're tall.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
didn't get it. Why would you be more claustrophobic if you were, and most of us are shorter than men, so I didn't get it. But anyway, yes,
Yes.
over here.
and
Sorry,
I'd
like
you
to
can see.
echo the comment of the previous person at this microphone, and even if you're not capable of writing the book, everyone in the room should share their memories, because we're at a point where we're passing
need it.
on and those memories are going
Yes.
to get lost.
Yes.
I'm Sarah Fitzgerald. My husband, Walt Werfel, worked in the Carter White House. I was pregnant in 1978, and I find young women are shocked to know that if I had delivered my child in February rather than June, my pregnancy costs would not have been covered by health insurance, because health insurers were not required to cover
Right.
pregnancy as a disability. back then.
disability,
It was something
right.
you were thought you could plan for, and so you could save up your money to cover the delivery of your child. The second thought I wanted to comment on is that my state, Virginia, has not yet ratified the Equal Rights Amendment.
Right.
I was down lobbying a year or two ago, and the thought occurred to me, I am older now than Liz Carpenter and Ellie Peterson were when they led the ERA America Coalition. And so I think that one of the important things about saving these memories is that I think the younger generation of
Yes.
women don't realize how recently these situations existed. And I also think that particularly with the current threats against women's reproductive health and just against women in general, we need to make sure that they're not forgotten.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And I would,
absolutely.
I want, Sarah, I want to make sure I get your number before we leave, because you are a live example of someone who is in the
Yeah.
transition of having
Yeah.
your baby right after the president
Yeah.
signed this law that enabled you to have coverage. And of course, you were in the White House, you were going to keep your job, but you know.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai.
Yes, this was fabulous, great stories, very important.
Sorry, introduce yourself.
My name is Kai Bird, and I'm working on a biography of Jimmy Carter for the last 4 years. I'm very slow. Anyway, this is a fabulous talk, but I can't resist asking you about Bella Abzug.
I know the story.
Carter also appointed Bella to the White House. And we all know her as a iconic figure of the feminist movement. But alas, she also didn't last very long in the White House. So I'm wondering if you have any stories about Bella and what happened to Bella.
You want to start? Or you want me to start? We both have Bella stories.
We do.
so-
Anyone
and
who
we
knows
don't have
her
enough time,
knew her.
by the way, to
Yeah,
talk the
it's-
Bella
yeah.
stories. Why don't you give the White House perspective, and I will give the agency perspective, because I had to support her as her staff.
Well, I don't know whether people know the story. She was one of the co-chairs of the National Advisory Commission on Women, whatever the name was, and that the president appointed. And there were a lot of great people,
women.
Gloria Steinem, Betty
Friedan,
and
head of
Betty
the
Ford.
Betty Ford, yeah, the head of the
bipartisan, Betty Ford.
head of the American Association of
Ellie
University Women.
Sneal,
Yeah,
head
University
of
Women.
Now. I mean,
Yeah, B'nai B'rith, Legal Women Voters.
Legal Women Voters. So it was-
Dorothy Height, National Council
Dorothy
of Negro
Height.
Women.
There were a lot of wonderful people. So, but the story is I don't know how long she was the chair.
Not long.
Not very long. She was quite a character, anybody who knew her. I actually had been on a panel. I've been on a panel with her way back in the day, actually at the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. I was sitting in between Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug. And I've never been seen as a moderate in my whole life, ever. And that was the only time in my whole life I was seen as a moderate. And I was the one who least used their hands. I would swear I was going to get hit by somebody. But anyway, there was one thing. First, the first meeting was called and supported by Alexis, and then they were going to have 15 minutes with the president, and then they decided they didn't want to come. So then the next meeting, they had an hour with the president, and just before the meeting, she issued an incredibly critical press release about the president before the meeting. Before the meeting. And so they had the meeting, and then after the meeting, Hamilton called her in and said to somebody in his room, I don't know, he told her that this wasn't working out. So that's what happened.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what happened. So at the Labor Department, we were the agency that housed the work of the commission, the task force that Bella chaired. So I was her designated staff person along with Ross Thomas, who is here, who really helped to support the work of the commission. It was always a difficult ride because Bella was always pushing against the administration. The president had started this work that Margaret and I talked about of examining, real sex discrimination in the federal government, trying to figure out where we could make a difference based on what was in our immediate control. I think Bella, God rest her soul, just didn't think we were fast enough, revolutionary enough. She wanted us to move not just in the purview of the federal government, which was our mandate, but more broadly. So there was always this tension and this push because of that. And then, of course, the famous White House meeting occurred. And that's what happened in terms of how she was let go. Lyndon Johnson Robb became the new chair of the commission after Bella. And we were able to proceed. As a matter of fact, I brought a copy. It might be the only book. I actually have a copy of the work that came out of that task force. It's called To the People of America, and it's their report on the efforts in the Carter administration. Bella had some very choice words for me leaving that
I'll bet.
White House
Would you
meeting.
like to share those?
I can't.
Not in a family setting.
Not in a family setting, yes.
Yeah, but I had to escort her out of the Labor Department. I had to help her pack up. It was a very painful, intense time. The commission was very split because
Some people resigned.
Yeah, Bella had a following. It was a very difficult moment for us as an administration, and everything that we are talking about and have talked about, I was personally worried it was going to be compromised and nullified because the Bella story was going to dominate the good work that was really going on, but it didn't.
It didn't.
And I have to say, to Bella's credit, at the end of the day, when we put out the report and we were all working for the president's reelection, she actually called me and apologized. And so I remember that moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Manju.
Thank you. Manju from Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you both for sharing all the history for some of us who were not even in the country. So thank you so much. I have a question for you looking forward. As you mentioned, women were a huge force and are a good number of voters in the country. And looking forward to the next election, what would be your message to especially women and coming out and voting in the next election? As you can see, it has a huge impact. And in the last election, especially presidential election, there was a particular section of women voters that really cost us having the first woman president.
Yeah. Thank God for black women, is what I can say, and women of color. I think that this is a time when women really need to understand what's at stake here and understand, from the Carter days, pre-Carter days, what was the status of women, and think about, we're going back there. Because one thing that's holding the line is the judiciary. And not only on choice, on a lot of other things that are trying to be pushed back. And the judiciary is so important to hold the line. And if we get another couple hundred judges that are 40 years old, it's going to be a problem. All of the kinds of things, the right in the workforce and your own body and health care, access to health care for women, just all those things I think are incredibly at risk for women. And we have got to find a way, not even in terms of Democrats or Republicans, but find a way to make women understand what's at risk here. Discrimination, loss of access to all kinds of things that we have assumed will always be there. And I don't assume it anymore. I really don't assume it anymore. So, it's women of color, it's women, young people. Not that I've given up on white men, but I've given up on a lot of white men. It's not the white men here, obviously. But, but I'm involved in a project with college students, over 1 million college students and 1,300 colleges. That's the other thing. Wherever you went to school, they have the statistics on your alma mater on the percentage of students who voted. Ask them for it. Because there are colleges where 80% of the students voted and colleges where 20% of the students voted. And they have the data. And if they tell you they don't, they do. And they have the data by grade level, by race, national origin, and by subject major. So thank God for librarians and teachers, teacher educators, because they're the ones who vote. And mathematicians and physicists, they don't vote. Anyway, so that's whether you call up and say, why are only 20% of people in my alma mater vote? Why are they only voting 20%? What are you going to do about it?
Good idea.
You need to vote. Anyway.
Well, when I think about your question, two things come to my mind. And I'm going to tell you why I went back to Rosalynn's quote. I think for this election that we have to really come together as women and figure out a very simple message of what is at stake so that we can speak more with one voice in this election. It reminds me of the ERA debate and how Rosalynn was able to speak to then we called traditional women in the home, the feminist movement, all of these women who were coming into the workforce. She was able to say, I enjoy my roles as a wife, a mother, a partner, a business. I care. I'm not threatened. I feel freed by it. I don't think when I think about these wonderful young millennials that they have any appreciation, this new generation, of the stories that we have been sharing. We don't talk to our daughters enough. We don't share the stories of what it was like not so long ago. I am an African American woman, and I know what moved me as a child growing up and even today. My family drummed into me the Tilden Hayes Compromise. And that was the compromise in the United States Senate, where after the Civil War, when the slaves were freed and we had all of the rights as freed slaves, that we went back to the Jim Crow era of segregation. And they literally wiped out all of the Freedmen's Bureau legislation that had been passed to support the freed slaves. And so I think in many ways the era of women and our rights started with Jimmy Carter. And we're in this period now. And I don't think there's an appreciation for the connection of the threads of history of what we are about to lose, maybe forever, in our generation if we don't change the profile of the presidency and the United States Senate in particular. And so we've got to find a way not to have polarizing conversations about women and rights. We've got to figure out what are those unifying messages where we can make it so clear that this really is about turning way back the clock on all of us.
Simple message.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Rita.
I'm Rita Thompson, and I help out at the Carter Center. And I want to make one comment to Becky over there about the book. I have the book. The title is Crying is a Cheap Female Trick. And hopefully, you all will get maybe a little bit of a copy next year. I may need a little help and some comments if any of you want to know a little bit more. Somebody has said, take cheap out of the title. Make it Crying is a Female Trick. That has bothered me just a little bit because the original statement was made to me 45 years ago. So, thanks.
Oh. I don't know what that means.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you both very much for the great job and the wonderful panel that you've led this morning.
Thank you.
You mentioned Donna Shalala. She was at HUD with me in the Carter administration, as well as Gail West was a special assistant to, I believe, the first African-American female secretary.
Pat Harris.
Pat Harris, and later served in the Clinton administration as an assistant secretary of the Air Force. Thank you for mentioning Patricia Tracy, who was the first Vice Admiral in the U.S. Navy, and many of you remember Paul Reeson, who was the special assistant or the Navy aide to President Carter, and he was the first 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy, and I had the privilege of calling President Carter to tell him that he was going to be the commander-in-chief of the Atlantic Fleet. So Jimmy Carter deserves a lot of credit for what he's done for women and what he's done for African Americans and minorities generally. So
thank you for that, Mr. Secretary. And I just have to say, as John takes his seat, Secretary Dalton takes his seat, we've talked a lot about the Carter connections that went to Clinton and to Obama, but I have to say we had a lot of male connections as well, and he was a big part of that forward thinking that was developed in the Carter administration that certainly was a tremendous help to us during the Clinton years, because the mindset got shaped during the Carter years. And so, John, I want to thank you for your leadership in the armed services of our nation. Thank you.
Sir.
My name's Mick Keno. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. This is my first time here. But I don't have any questions. I have a recommendation. I would love to have this seminar be required watching by 20 people on the Democratic list that are running for president and the panelists that ask the questions, because it is eye-opening. I thought I was pretty informed, and I was not. And this has been a very informative seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, thank you for informing us and inspiring all of us. As a young woman, my name is Rebecca Dwyer. I'm from Miami, Florida. And my question is, so recently I've seen at the Heart of Gold the documentary about the young gymnasts who were affected by Larry Nassar. And it was insane to hear how so many people went to the police to the universities, to the people who run the Olympics, and they were still not heard, especially as young women and children. And I feel like even at that Olympic level, there are probably other cases that are happening locally. And even with Harvey Weinstein, that happened in such an insane entertainment field that should have HR, but let's say there isn't. So how do we move forward productively when we are turned away from so many important people who are supposed to respect us and listen to us and hear our voices? You know, like, where do we go? And how do we inform and educate young women to go there? That isn't just the media. It sucks how, in order to be heard, we have to put it on a newspaper, just like the women in At the Heart of Gold. So I love to hear your wisdom and experience.
You want to talk about Title IX?
It is heartbreaking to watch what young women have gone through. And, you know, I'm from Boston, and in 2002, when the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe unveiled all of what they did about the Catholic Church, I think it shook everybody to their core. But I think it's one of the most important things that's happened for women and survivors of sexual abuse. But you think it would have changed everything, right? You think like it opened the door and people like, okay, now we can talk about it, are scared, people in authority, but not enough. The instinct of institutions is to protect. Now, I ran 2 universities, and in both universities, I had to train and convince the people who work for me that when this kind of thing happened, our job was not defense. Our job was support. Because the first thing they do is, how do we protect ourselves? That is the instinct at the organization. And so, but the first thing is, what can we do to help this person? You know, it is that is the instinct at every kind of organization. So as a young woman, as a woman or a man who's been sexually harassed, I think you do go through the process. I think you do go to the police, but then I think you go to an organization who supports these kinds of things, whether it's a rape center or a women's group or a sexual survivor group in your city who can tell you where to go and what to do. And in every city, there are those groups. But it's so important to go and report it to someone who will listen and make sure it goes through the right system. And secondly, to be heard about what happened to you and to get the kind of support people need, because otherwise it sits with you forever, and I've seen that happen to people. So I think it's a very important question, and it's something that I think organizations are still struggling with and haven't gotten there yet. So,
And I want to answer your question, but before I do, you just reminded me of another Carter first.
yeah.
That I can't let this moment pass. And when we were doing the review of those sexual guidelines in the federal government, it was Jimmy Carter who amended again Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, sex discrimination, and included women in sports for the very first time in Title IX. In Title IX. So that women athletes could get scholarships, they could get the support. It was Jimmy Carter who opened the eyes of the academic community to the power of women in the whole sports arena. And as we were talking, we forgot about that part of his legacy because it goes back to your question. He opened the door, and look what's happening now.
Right.
So I have 2 responses to your question. First, I believe that every generation has to define for itself what it means to be an American. And in your instance, your generation, particularly the young women, are still trying to sort through all of the changes, to understand the abuses. Because in many ways, your generation inherited what was supposed to be the promise of America and not really in touch with the practice of America, of what was going on in many places, as you've just described. And so a part of what we have to do, your generation, we have to find ways to connect better to that legacy, to that journey, so that you're not surprised by what is occurring, okay? And in doing so, I think coming to grips with the reality of the many of the practices of our country spurs your generation to greater action. Look what's happening on the gun violence front. Look what you're doing on the environmental front. I mean, your generation is really taking the leadership there. When it comes to this whole question of sexual harassment, I think we all have to step back and invest in what I call the power of one. Beyond what's going on in social media, and we've got a great reporter here from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, you really have to ask people, what are you doing in your time, in your space, in your place to make a difference? And you need to challenge your peers, your own social networks. You know, I'm fortunate enough to sit on 4 major Fortune 50 boards now in this country. Every single one of our companies, we have taken our own path and journey to examine in great detail the practices that support or not support, not just sex discrimination, but looking very clearly at sexual harassment and what are we doing to eradicate it. And so you can't assume that somebody else is going to take care of the problem. This kind of a movement requires the engagement of all of us. And sometimes it can feel like it's so up here, you don't know what to do. And I encourage you to step back, look at your own network, look at your own environment, and ask that question. What are you doing in your time, in your place, in your space to make that difference now?
Thank you.
We done?
Okay, one last question. One last question.
Yes, outstanding presentation and an eye-opening historical perspective. What I'd like to ask, and it's really for the Carter Center, is where can I direct my 2 sisters so that they can watch this?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the answer, but Story does.
Stay tuned. We'll turn this into a video that will be available, and we'll let you know how.
Now that was absolutely incredible, both for those of us who remember what it was like and for those who may not understand yet how much there is to lose. So please join me in thanking Secretary Herman and Ms. McKenna. I'll do that. Okay.